make sure our videographer is here.
Good point. It's all right. Yeah, but that's why. That's that. I love it. Thank you for getting that for me. And I think, I know it's hard to probably have got to trade.
I am. Yeah, I know. Okay, great. Board members to the table. Okay, we have 8 members in the room. So, Mr. Malloy. That's fine. Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and begin our discussion on the legislative program. Everyone will have heard the full proposed changes by staff to the program this past Thursday evening, so we are certainly not going to go back through all of those changes. And today's discussion will essentially be just an overview of the suggested topics for amendments, along with some feedback that Mr. Malloy wanted to give us from Thursday's discussion. And finally, we'll be grateful to hear board member feedback on proposed legislative priorities. As you know, we hope to have a nice and succinct document up front that our legislators can draw from. So with that, I will pass it over to Michael.
All right. Good, I guess it's good evening, everybody. I apologize that I'm the last thing between you and the Nats game tonight, so hopefully I'll be able to get you out of here relatively quickly. You all actually have already heard the prefatory remarks on the legislative program. The presentation that I made to you on Thursday night really kind of highlighted all of the different areas that staff has made recommendations for changes to the legislative program. As part of that conversation, you all asked some very good questions, some questions that required some additional information, but also brought up some issues that may require some potential amendment language. So what I'm initially going to do is I'm going to talk through a few of those things that came up Thursday night, and then we'll build from that part of the conversation. But I did want to try and address some of the things that did come up at the Thursday night conversation. So first are more kind of informational pieces. A question was asked about the difference between state requirements for testing and federal requirements for testing, because you all do have a priority position talking about reducing the emphasis on standardized tests, and one area that is often discussed as a difference is how the state deals with testing versus how the federal government deals with testing. In broad strokes, the federal government requires testing in mathematics and in English grades 3 through 8, so every single year during that time span, and then once in high school, and that's for math and for English. For science, they require a test grades 3 through 5, a test grades 6 through 8, and a test sometime in high school. That gives you 17 mandated tests at the federal level, and that's the federal requirement. There are no requirements for civics or history tests, there's no requirements for writing tests. And those are the two places when you look at the tests that Virginia has, where Virginia goes above and beyond what the federal requirements are, is we do have testing in Virginia Studies, Civics and Economics, writing in the 8th grade, English 11 writing end of course. So we do have those additional tests in Virginia. They're not required by the federal government, but every time you have a discussion at the state level about those particular tests, obviously you don't go too far in terms of reducing those tests. Now, one potential area for change, at least in terms of the emphasis on standardized tests versus maybe a more performance-based assessment, is in those areas where those tests aren't required by the federal government. So again, history, civics, writing, those can be more performance-based. You could make a shift at the state level to a more performance-based assessment as opposed to a more standardized SOL. Again, that has been proposed in the General Assembly, and it runs into a good deal of resistance in kind of a more traditional view of accountability of that history tests, and you need to know who George Washington is, and you need to have kind of factual information. But that's the difference really in a nutshell between how the federal government deals with testing and how the state government deals with testing, and the kind of wiggle room that you might have as a board to make some changes or to recommend some changes. So that was kind of the first area that I wanted to address. The second, and I caught Ms. Schultz before she walked out because I wanted to make sure that she knew that I had gotten this information for her. Virginia ranks 40th in terms of state effort for public education funding. You'll remember she had asked the question because there is some data in your joint legislative program with the county about local effort being around 11th in the country. So local effort is relatively speaking high. She wanted to know what the flip side picture was. Just so you know, I went to the original JLARC study that the local information came from, and they actually didn't have the state information, the flip side state information. They didn't emphasize that part of it. So I had to go to the the Commonwealth Institute, which keeps a lot of education data, and the data I was able to pull up was from 2018. So Virginia does rank fairly low in terms of the state's effort for public education funding as compared to national averages. And then finally, there was actually two more things. One, there's a question about the impact of proposed changes at the federal level in Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program eligibility on free and reduced meals. What I was able to find out is that there's been some proposed rulemaking at the federal Department of Agriculture that would change what's called the categorical eligibility program for some of the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program grantees. The projections on that are that there could be as many as 500,000 students across the country that could lose access to free and reduced meals by the change that's being proposed in how the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is working. What I've been able to figure out is that data wasn't included in the initial rulemaking process, so there have been requests to either pull the rule back completely or to amend the notice and have another 60-day public comment period in order to be able to respond to that particular component of the change in SNAP eligibility.
We also just got today, I mean, you're in here, you're trying to work and do the work session, right? Dr. Lane's sending some information about the public charge legislation and its impact on food and nutrition. So I have Mr. Smith and his team looking at that. It's pages and pages. I want to try to boil it down and give you some analysis for us to the degree that we can. So we know there's a bit of a swirl going on around these issues of legislative or changes that are being made in the administration, the national administration, and the impact on food and nutrition. So we're working to get that to you very soon. I hope to have something by Friday's BB to share with you.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I really appreciate that because we have certain schools that this could just be devastating to.
And in terms of your existing program and your existing positions, you do have a position Under your student wellness, I think it's under student wellness that deals with state reimbursement for free and reduced lunch and for school breakfast program. But your program isn't directly responsive to something like this. So I do have some draft language which kind of focuses on changes in eligibility requirements, which may have an impact on the ability for our students to access those programs, which I can share with you if that's something that you want to pursue for the final action agenda item. And then the fourth item where I was asked for some specific information, and this one I actually don't have any specific information, but I wanted to let you know that I did make an inquiry. The proposed position in the draft program that talks about asking the state to reconsider their use of chronic absenteeism as an quote other academic indicator under Virginia's federal ESSA plan. I did not get a good answer back on what we would propose in terms of replacing that indicator with. There are a number of different candidates for indicators that could be used as an alternative, but I didn't get a real clear consensus in terms of what we might. So that's a conversation that I think, even going forward with the legislative language, it's generic enough that it would allow you to continue to have that conversation about what the best alternative might be in terms of what we propose to the state if they do decide to move away from that chronic absenteeism position. The other issue with the chronic absenteeism language is that in the draft that you see on the agenda item, that was actually proposed to be added to your federal legislative position because it dealt with the state's ESSA program. I think the recommendation is going to be to move that into your standards of accreditation position and make it more of a state-centered, because it really is the State Board of Education's decision as to what indicator they use. So I think that's, even though it really does affect the federal side, it's more of a state-level decision. So I would propose that you move that, just import that language from the federal piece where it was originally proposed and move it into the standards of accreditation position. All right, so those were the four kind of informational pieces that I had. I will let you know, and there were various discussions about a number of different issues, and I'll just kind of tell you what I have language prepared for you all on. So if board members brought these issues up and wish to bring it as an amendment to the program, I do have at least an initial set of draft language that I can work with you on and bring to the table. The first one is the issue of students who have limited or interrupted formal education. That's something that we kind of talk about indirectly in the program, but don't have any direct mention of it. So I do have a draft of how the state might address that, focusing in on actually coming up with a standardized definition, because different places refer to it in different ways. There's students with interrupted formal education, there's students with limited or interrupted formal education. There's different thresholds that places use, so it'd be good to kind of get a standardized definition across the state so that we're all talking about the same population. And then at the same time, how do you incorporate that particular population and its particular needs into state accreditation measures? So that's one. Second one is, and you may have talked about this, I wasn't here for the entire discussion on Project Momentum, but the idea of using indicators and the way the state treats indicators for student academic success, particularly for English language learners, and importing that into non-academic indicators of student success, so something like dropout. So using similar, if not exactly the same standards that the state is currently using in how they incorporate academic achievement into accountability measures, they should be using similar metrics and similar ways of incorporating those non-academic indicators like dropout rate into measures of state accreditation. The third, actually, I already mentioned to you in terms of moving the issue of chronic absenteeism out of federal and moving it under the state program piece. I have that ready to go. I do have language to address the great schools issue, and as I had mentioned, I think at the table on Thursday, It really focuses more in on encouraging especially the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level, which does rely somewhat on the Great Schools data, to urge them to partner with states and localities and use state-derived data, so use the actual accountability systems that each state has gone through the work of determining, as opposed to using kind of a national, non-governmental aggregator of that sort of data. So that's an approach that you can take to that particular issue. I was able to draft up some language on the issue of menstrual hygiene product availability, both in terms of supporting state resources to be able to address it, but also on the federal side, it would be less of a direct approach. It would be more along the lines of allowing some of the existing programs for low-income families to purchase feminine hygiene products as a necessity as opposed to as a luxury. Under a lot of the programs, they're classified as luxuries as opposed to necessities, so they're not eligible to be for like WIC and special supplemental nutrition program funding. And then finally, I just have some real brief language to address the issue on environmental stewardship, because you do have an existing program that encourages the state to pursue environmental stewardship activities, but it doesn't have the flip side, which is to remove the barriers to them, because oftentimes it's a barrier that's in place. For example, deploying additional solar panels or additional solar capacity. There's actually a barrier at the state level to do that, as opposed to requiring the state to incentivize that sort of use. So those were the main issues that I hopefully heard everybody talk about on Thursday, and hopefully had language at least ready for discussion. So if any of you brought those things up and wish to pursue them, please let me know, and we can work on it between now and the final action item. I did have three kind of last things to present to you, which have come up, and because there's always something happening in the legislative world, have come up literally in the last few days, or at least have kind of crystallized in the last few days. So I'm going to have some recommended language for you in 3 areas. One is actually, and this was an inadvertent oversight on my part, was you had a follow-up action item from a September work session about school safety audits, and I had not drafted language to address that. I do have language that I can give to you that addresses that issue of your annual certification of school safety programs, and really allowing it to be, that certification to be either conducted by a local school board or at the local school board's discretion at your designee. So you can designate the superintendent or other staff to kind of be in charge of that sort of a review. That would parallel language that's already existing in that section of code, which allows the designee for every other entity that has to take a look at those programs. So between the fire marshal and other kind of local and state safety folks, they can designate someone. It's just at school boards, the way it was drafted, it looks like school boards themselves have to do it. So that would be responsive to what you had asked for in that September audit work session. 2 others. One is, and we've heard recently that there's some movement at the state level to allow for some flexibility in how measures of student academic performance, particularly in terms of how students perform on standardized tests, how they're incorporated into teacher evaluation systems. So I'm going to bring you some language which talks about having some additional flexibility and how those student academic measures are incorporated into the teacher evaluation system at the state level. And then the third one, and I told you a little bit about this on Thursday night, and we've clarified with the county, is some language to make your program on early childhood more parallel to what the county has, and ask the state to allow us to shift from an eligibility threshold at 250% of the federal poverty rate to 300% of the federal poverty rate, which would have the effect of potentially making more families eligible for VPI program funding. So that's my kind of follow-up to your Thursday night discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. So And thank you for the work over the weekend that you clearly put into this. I want to remind board members we're going to be discussing amendments, either those that have already been brought forward or other potential amendments, things you want considered for the priorities document, and anything else further for consideration. So I have Karen Corbett Sanders, Karen Keys-Gamarra, and Sandy Evans.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I want to start with you gave us we fall 40 in the country for state funding and top 10% for local funding. Where are we as far as the allocation from the federal government? Because I know we only get 2%, and how does that compare to where the federal government funds other jurisdictions? And I don't expect you to have that number today, but it would be one that would be helpful to us.
Off the top of my head, I mean, I can't give you an exact percentage, but I know that because the federal government, most of the federal government funding is predicated on need and is predicated on measures like division-wide poverty. We receive a relatively low percentage of our entire budget from federal sources, and that includes the allocations we get under IDEA. So for the federal payments for students with disabilities, that includes that. As in, we still rank, I would say, relatively, if not very low, on the amount of money that we get from the federal government.
No, I understand that, especially when you also look at that we operate a school on a military base and get very little compensation for it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing an amendment for the free and reduced meals and what we should be doing on that. Really like your moving forward on early childhood. The last piece is looking at giving us flexibility in how we can support students coming into our high schools that that are at risk for dropout, that we need to have flexibility in how we can offer them programming so that they are not treated like a traditional high school student.
Yeah, I think in part some of what I was talking about in the draft language may help with that. There was also draft language that's in your packet under student attendance that talks about kind of dealing with students that are over the compulsory age for attendance and how they're treated under compulsory attendance laws, which is a little bit of an ironic situation. So there's, I think, between those two pieces that kind of touches at what you're talking about.
That's part of it. And then the last piece, as we're looking at trying to provide more opportunities for our students to have workforce experiences, especially in the skilled trades. It's my understanding that apprenticeships, there's some limitation on the age when students can get apprenticeships. And so if we can look at getting changes to that, I know of a couple of people who are willing to work with us on it. But today, I believe it's 18 you have to be to have an apprentice and apprenticeship, and we want to have more flexibility, I think, in that area.
Okay, we can
Thank
work on that.
Great. Okay. Karen Keys-Gamarra, followed by Sandy.
First of all, thank you. And Ms. Corbett Sanders addressed one of my concerns with respect to where we're ranking. When you get that additional information, if you could just provide that for us, it's quite helpful. I really don't have any questions. I just wanted to ask for that information in writing, where Virginia ranks, where we rank locally, and as Ms. Corbett Sanders said, and just wanted to give a comment that I'm glad to discover that the need for menstrual products is a luxury. Thank you.
Just to clarify on the federal piece, there will be kind of a difference between how Virginia ranks in terms of what the federal funding looks like versus how Fairfax County ranks in terms of receiving federal funding. Because when we talk about we're 40th for state effort, there's not really an analogous where X percent or we rank somewhere among the 50 states, because each individual jurisdiction receives a different percentage of funding. So the way I'll provide it to you is I'll kind of tell you where Fairfax rates among Virginia localities in terms of the percentage that our budget's made up of federal funding.
I appreciate that, and I made a comment with respect to the menstrual products. Is there any way we can help our legislature understand that issue more accurately? Because I don't believe it's a luxury, and that may be hurting us in some of the initiatives that we may need to address in the future.
The first step would be adding it in here as legislative language, and then we could have that communication with our offices.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we have Sandy, followed by Janie and Megan.
Thanks very much, particularly for creating language. I would be very interested in working on the one involving the SIFE definitions and how to incorporate that into our accreditation measures, as well as the using the EL dropout rate for things like the dropout rates, as well as the great schools issue. And I believe Ms. Corbett Sanders is interested in some or all of those three issues as well. So I would be interested in working with you and seeing what the language is on those three. I also, in looking at the priorities, the piece about the students with interrupted formal education and receiving students, newcomer students at an older age, high poverty English language students and students with interrupted formal education, I would hope that we could somehow incorporate that into the one-page priorities. I think that should be a top priority, and even though we have something about assessment reforms, that doesn't really capture this particular issue. So as one board member, I think that that's, I have no quarrel with any of these other things that are listed as priorities. I think they are all priorities, but I would hope we could add that, because that is a fundamental long-term issue that we're going to deal with, the fact that we have so many newcomer students, and that impacts, that will impact our accreditation if we don't have differing definitions.
Great, Sandy.
Just one point of clarification. We did have the 2019 priorities posted. That really is just kind of the beginning of your conversation about what your 2020 priorities might look like, because if you look under 2019 state priority positions, number one on the list is school calendar. That probably doesn't need to carry forward into 2020. So I think that's a conversation that you all as a board will need to have. But those I've heard those similar issues: attendance, dropout rate, students with limited English, formal education as possible additions to the priority list.
Okay, thank you, Sandy, and that's been noted. Janie, Megan, and Tammy.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions. There's probably no good answer, but the proffer laws, I know that last session, our Board of Supervisors were able to sort of surgically keep the areas right along the metro out of the new proffer law problem. Is there any chance at all of ever going back and helping with capital dollars as a result of development? Because the development comes beyond the metro stops. I mean, that's what, certainly in my end of the county, that we're all struggling with.
So the county actually was able to secure even more in terms of proffer reform
Okay.
than just the kind of the surgical
Right, 'cause
areas
that was what I
around
appreciate.
the metros. The way they've left their program position is they want to see how the new reforms play out before deciding if they're going to continue to push forward for asking for additional changes, because the initial proffer law fell victim to the law of unintended consequences, right? Is that it's
The rural community is one.
yeah, there's a whole bunch of consequences that no one foresaw. So they did make a number of changes this past year. So they didn't take a formal position to go above and beyond what they had already done. They wanted to wait and see how those things played out and how the proffers started to continue to flow or start to reflow before going forward with too much more in the way of reform. So I probably take that as our guidance in terms, because your position talks about flexibility for the use of proffers, and that has traditionally paralleled what the county has said.
Right, because I would think Arlington, Loudoun, and Fairfax, I mean, what we all are projected to experience and are beginning to experience now, that there would be some commonality there. And going back to impact aid and all the impact aid that we never get any, I mean, I know it's in our position, it's been in there for 40 years.
Well, I mean, at the root of the issue with impact aid is that the program is not funded to the levels that it was envisioned. And the mechanics of the impact aid program are such that if the program is not funded to 100%, they ramp back the funding, and the funding gets ramped back from jurisdictions that have the relatively lowest, again, division-wide impact of federal properties on their jurisdiction. So you may have an individual property that has a significant impact in one area, but when you look division-wide, exactly the same way as when you, at the state level, look at division-wide poverty, it doesn't look the same as that kind of pocket of impact that there might be. So there have been proposals to make changes in that, but unless, like with the LCI, like with any other issue, unless there's substantial new money that's put into the program, that ends up creating winners and losers, and that kind of stops
That
the
never works.
discussion in its tracks.
Okay, great, thank you, thank you for that explanation. The last piece is.
Ms. Strauss, you've run out of your time, so if you want to just wrap up and get to go back.
I was just going to, it's okay, I'm going to talk with Ken Plum about adult ed, and he began his career in ACE and actually 4-H, so it'd be interesting to know. He may have some better ideas on how to deal with our sight kids.
Great. Okay, Megan, then Tammy.
So I appreciate, Michael, what you've pulled together for us. I'm looking at this draft document, and as I understand it, the way it will be presented to our General Assembly is it leads off with the joint legislative priority positions between the Board of Supervisors and the school board, correct?
Actually, the document itself is, once you as a board decide on your state priorities and your federal priorities, the first thing that you would see in the document would be your one-pager on state priorities. That would be followed by your joint position with the county, which is primarily focused on funding issues, and then your positions on all the other issues. And then the same thing would be true on the federal side. The federal priorities would come first, and then the remainder of the federal position would follow right behind.
Okay, the reason I asked is because I do think it's important for the board, since it is our, we own this, you guys, what we're going to communicate to the General Assembly. And so I'm just looking at this document that the board was provided, and in the top of it says Fairfax County Board of Supervisors and School Board Joint Legislative Party Position. And then it gives, sort of a narrative intro, and then it says the boards, plural, strongly support, and then it gives a bunch of bullet points. So the only reason why I'm asking is because it's one thing for us to agree content-wise what we want in here, but then in terms of presentation, some of us have had concerns that especially our state delegates and senators will say, I still don't really understand where your priorities are. They want something that's easily readable. I really like how this is broken out, that alphabetically, starting with after-school programs, at-risk youth, and gang prevention, and it gives what the school board's position is on things. I would just say for where it's the board's plural, similarly, I would like to see us put in bold some of like the key phrases like the cost of competing adjustment, the COCA, that would be bolded, something that just helps the reader when they're looking at this understand that with each bullet point, what's the key bucket area that we're talking about. And then finally, since I've got 41 seconds, and I definitely want you to comment. In the 8 years I've been on the board, I continue to hear, Virginia ranks in the bottom 10 in funding, but top 10 in wealth. But I'm looking at this document in front of us where it says the JLARC study said we ranked 23rd nationally. And then I looked at the 2009 Census Bureau data and the 2016 Census Bureau data. And Virginia pretty much hovers somewhere in the low to mid 20s. I think most recently in the 2016, we ranked 24. I'm not saying that's great, because given our wealth, Virginia could fund more. But I would like to have a little bit more as a next step information on, we have a responsibility to speak factually about how we fund, and I don't want to keep saying we rank in the bottom 10, 40 out of 50 when we don't. And I know that there can be context, but it's not about what they're funding Fairfax County schools or Fairfax County jurisdiction. We have to speak, first of all, what does the state give? So if you can speak to that, and I'll have a go back.
The important distinction to make between ranking 40th for the state's effort for education versus the data that you were citing in terms of us being 23rd or 25th, that data that looks at us being 23rd or 25th is state plus local effort combined. That's where we rank in terms of total education funding. So what is happening is that the locality, because the localities are going above and beyond what the state is doing, it's making our overall funding look okay, look like we're middle of the pack, but that's almost entirely because localities go so far above and beyond what the state does in terms of education funding. So you're kind of looking at two different data sets. You're looking at the total funding for education where we look like we're okay, but when you break that out, it's localities that are doing the lion's share of making us look okay because we're ranked 11th in terms of local effort, and it's the state that's not pulling its share because they're ranked 40th in terms of the state's effort.
So that's why the next step data, I think we need the homework behind that, because if we're talking to our community and they do what I just did, they're going to say, you don't know what you're talking about. And I think it's going to be really important that we have a way of showing how that breaks out between locality versus state and why it's so much worse than it might actually look.
A dream for me would be if we could get that in one of our beautiful infographics we do for our state local funding, so we can show it.
We can actually develop something to bring to to your legislative briefing in November. Because we already have the infographic on where our populations fall nationwide, but we can work on something that would do exactly that and show local effort, state effort, overall effort, but show it's really the local effort that's making it so that we're close to the national average.
Excellent. Yes, completely agree.
Megan, if you have further comments, please just go ahead and get them out now, and then we'll go to Tammy, okay? Instead of doing a go back.
Oh, well, I guess the only other thing I just wanted to add again was the challenge we have about advocating for more state funding for public education is that until we fix the LCI, we're better off bringing our local dollars where 100% of the local dollars stay with us versus they raise the state income tax, they take, the 80% of the money and keep it and send 20% back to us. So I do hope that we're going to figure out a way through the Board of Supervisors and the school board to know that Prince William County right next door gets such a more favorable LCI and get so much more state funding dollars per pupil compared to us. That's a part, Michael, I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more of why does Fairfax County take such a hit on the LCI compared to Prince William and or Loudoun? And what does that look like when you think about our region?
So the way the local composite index is calculated is it's kind of a composite and it's a proxy for local wealth. So you look at individual income, you look at sales tax, and you look at property wealth. The way that data is aggregated, and then it's compared to your student population versus your overall population. So essentially, Virginia ranks all 132 jurisdictions based on those metrics. Those metrics, there's absolutely no adjustment for the difference in cost of living across regions. So the fact that you can purchase a house in Fairfax County for $500,000, and if you were to put it on a tractor trailer and drive it anywhere else in the Commonwealth of Virginia and drop it down on a lot, it would be worth $200,000. That $300,000 of property wealth counts as $300 of actual wealth against Fairfax County, as opposed to the jurisdiction where that house might otherwise be. So because the state doesn't do any sort of adjustment for the difference in cost of living, you have these kind of odd-looking things where our wealth looks so much higher than what our purchasing power might actually otherwise look like. The other thing to remember is that, and you brought up the example of Prince William County, there are 132 school divisions who have an opinion about the local composite index. There are 132 different opinions about the local composite index, and everybody has their own thing that they wish the local composite index would do better. Prince William County, other rural jurisdictions that have a lot of land set aside for conservation easements, want that land to be devalued even further than it is now. They don't want that to count as wealth against their county because it's being set aside as for conservation. So the challenge with the local composite index is, because everybody has a different opinion and because it's a fight over a finite amount of money, it's not a fight over an additional amount of money. If it was an additional amount of money, that might be a different conversation. But because it's just the way the pie is divided, it always runs into issues. I mean, literally, you will go into the General Assembly, someone will have a proposal, there will be a spreadsheet where there are 132 jurisdictions, and it will show what you get before and what you get after. There's not much conversation about the merits of the policy other than where you fall on those two columns.
One nugget, if I could, Michael, the longer I keep thinking about this, the last time I looked at the LCI, the math calculation was in my doctorate class for finance with Richard Salmon, who was one of the people at Virginia Tech who helped create the original formula. I think we need to maybe think about an infographic that shows the LCI broken out. We talk about it, but the bottom line, the biggest differential between Fairfax and Prince William, if I was just on the street, is my same house here compared to Prince William costs double. That's where your 23 to 45% is coming. You go take your house right now and you look for that similar house in Prince William, it's half the cost. So the real estate piece is of that LCI components, sales taxes some, but real estate is a huge drive, and it doesn't really, it's not been updated since 1971 when real estate was in a whole different place. It doesn't really account for the real estate booms that have happened in just a few parts of the Commonwealth.
It also discounts all agriculture. So all those horse farms, wineries, things like that are taken out of the calculation. And so even though the average wealth is higher than Loudoun County, it gets discounted when you take away all that.
And the now, I think, 17-year-old JLARC study, the last major comprehensive study of the local composite index, made some recommendations in terms of how to adjust it based on the reality at that time of how those factors, the property wealth versus income versus sales tax, had adjusted over time since the LCI was first put into place, but they've sat on a shelf gathering dust since that time. And 17 years forward, those recommendations are obsolete. You'd have to do another set of calculations to figure out what the appropriate mix of those different items are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, thanks. And now we're to our last speaker, Tammy.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for your work. Thank you for the 2 one-pagers. I know you worked on that over the weekend, so thank you. We talked about that. Or did you have those, the 2 one-pagers when we were?
Last year.
Oh, those are last year's. Oh, you did the amendments. Okay, because I didn't notice that. Sorry. Okay. Well, we're talking about needing those. I know we talked about those at the board table, so I know you'll get to those then. Thank you. The one thing that we didn't talk about and I forgot to bring up on Thursday was Megan, and maybe you can help me with terminology, Megan, on the skipped committee. We talked about alternatives because the meals tax didn't work, and we talked about instituting an education tax in some way. And I can't remember exactly specifically how we were going to do that, but it was basically going to be, a way to do it, just adding on, to I'm not sure if it was ever defined, and that's what I'm trying to recall and skip. But Michael, have you heard about that? Have you talked to the county people about that? As far as, when the meals tax, you were going to get an extra percentage on, your meals. But Skip talked about, like, there are counties that have just done an education tax, for it, and it's a pool and it's a fund. Has there been have you been alerted to any of that?
That doesn't immediately ring a bell. I know that there have been proposals at the state level to have like a local income tax dedicated to education, or an additional increment on sales tax dedicated to education. Now, the sales tax piece, I think, has been overridden by the changes that were made on the transportation side a number of years ago, so there haven't been any recent conversations about that. More of the conversation at the state level in terms of taxing is this concept of equalizing city and county taxing authority. If you all were sitting in a city, your discussion about the meals tax would not have happened because the city can simply impose a meals tax, whereas a county has to go through a referendum. There are similar restrictions on other taxing authorities that cities have access to. Their transient occupancy tax, so the tax that they charge for hotel and for tourism, that's uncapped, and it doesn't have to be dedicated just to tourism. They have more flexibility in how that funding comes back. They can charge an admissions tax. They have more flexibility over a cigarette tax. So cities have far more local flexibility on their taxing authority than counties do, and you actually do share a position. It's not in your joint position, but the county also talks about that the concept of equalizing, so that counties have similar taxing authority to that cities have. Sometimes that discussion has been to target that equalization, but the city-county taxing authority is a more general conversation.
But is that one you think that's going to come up this year?
It's actually been discussed the last few years. It doesn't go very far, but it is discussed, especially on the Senate side. They've had conversations about it, primarily in terms of the disparity and in terms of kind of trying to find ways to help like rural counties.
Right.
That rural counties might benefit from being able to tap into different types of wealth because they just don't have the property, the property tax base that they can go and ask, but they might have a tourism attraction in their jurisdiction. They might have something else where they could generate some additional revenue and not put as much of the pressure on local property taxes. So that part of it has gotten traction, but it hasn't gotten extremely far.
Okay, all right, that's okay. She's distracting me, I'm sorry. Oh, my next thing is maybe, Madam Chair, we need to talk about, as this board switches over, how Michael's going to report back to us as far as, because right when you start your session, we're going to have a new board, and Mr. McElveen has chosen not to run for re-election, so we will not have him on our board. And I think that's the one thing, you do such great work, but I don't always feel we have set up a system that helps you help us the best way. So if we can maybe, Madam Chair and Dr. Brabrand, look at how that can be, so we can be nimble enough if we ever need to come down there, or also, so we, and I know some of the stuff, it just happens so fast, and you can't even keep up with us, those first, but then there's a point in time where you're just like, okay, now these are things we can concentrate on, and this is what's come out of committee, and this is what's gaining traction. So I feel like that's the part we really need to improve upon.
The
From
issue
our
of
side.
specifically to the issue of transition, that's actually been handled in different ways every 4 years. I remember there's probably 3 or 4 different models about how that was addressed. I can work with Dr. Brabrand, and we can kind of put our heads together in terms of kind of the best way to address that. I mean, obviously with the board, have that conversation about what the best way to address transition issues are, but also the communications. We can work on that as well during the session.
And the date for dropping bills is what date?
It starts, I believe, November 17th. but ends December 5th. There's a very narrow window because you have 100 new members that are being elected, that are coming in. And also the pre-filing window is narrower in budget sessions because they're supposed to spend more of their time on the budget. Now, having said that, they will drop exactly the same number of bills that they do any other time. That doesn't stop them necessarily in terms of the ideas that they'll put in. But it is, for them, functionally speaking, it's a relatively narrow window. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be having a conversation with the legislator right now to determine what we might ask them to put in when that clock starts. That's, something you can certainly start at any time, and particularly after the board has adopted the legislative program. You've got October. You're done with your legislative program October 24th. You have your briefing November 25th, but that gives you a lot of time to have conversations with members of the General Assembly of particular priorities.
Okay, we have a couple folks that have questions, so 30 seconds each. Karen Keys-Gamarra, then Dahlia, then Megan.
This is really quick. I was looking at C3 and 4, I believe you said dealt with the attendance, and I know we talked about the SIFE students and how we might be able to put that into some legislative language. Is that the language you're referring to, or you're preparing something different?
This language would stay. So this was a language that I talked about as being kind of indirectly addressing it. We'll bring you language that more directly and more specifically addresses the SLIFE students, and also that issue of the academic indicators versus the non-academic indicators. So we'll address both of those much more directly.
Okay, Dahlia, then Megan.
So this could be a next step, because we're sidebarring here about the history of Arlington County being a county/city. So I don't know if at some point you can just share with us some of that history and how that came about, so we can see if that's a future avenue.
Just so you're aware, the biggest issue is road maintenance. By far, that's the biggest issue in terms of transforming yourself from a county into a city. And I think what they did was they came up with a special arrangement,
Right.
but it's also because they're much smaller and didn't have as many road miles to deal with.
Right, well,
But
I've heard rumors the county's having that conversation, so it'd be nice to know. Okay, thank you.
Great, and, yeah, go ahead.
If I could just say 10 seconds on that. Either it's moving to cities or it's giving counties the same tool. I left for 5 years, and in a different area with different sets of community, whatever, I was in a city with a 7-cent meals tax. Think about where I was, 7 cents. And downtown has blossomed with restaurants. So there is a whole, when you get out of the bubble of here and start to look at lodging, tourism, there are so many other levers that, frankly, depending, I think the school board needs to wait and then determine if Northern Virginia has more power in the next session than it did before, to begin to look at rectifying the ultimate equity issue in Virginia, which is the complete disparate treatment between counties and cities.
Okay, and Megan has the last word.
So that tees up exactly why I wanted the go back. I know, Michael, you mentioned that both the Board of Supervisors and the school board have something here about the equalization of taxing authority. Then I would like to see that listed in the very front, where we had, these are our shared positions, whatever their language is. On the Board of Supervisors side, do they have that language?
They have language in their legislative program. It's not included in their version of the joint position. So we'd have to have a conversation if they would be willing to add it to their joint position to parallel you adding it to your joint position.
I
You can't-
think that would be, colleagues, my advocacy. We own this, so I'd like to see if there's support for it. But we need to drive this conversation. If they can't fix the LCI to be fair with our pockets of poverty and the lack of funding we're getting from the state, then we get the inverse, which is give us the equalization of taxing authority that the cities have. I mean, they can't handcuff Fairfax County in two different ways, which is, one, you get no taxing authority, and we're going to shortchange you on the LCI. So we deserve to have one or the other, and that would be my advocacy. I would really like to see that being done for this upcoming package.
Okay, great. I think we had a couple next steps, perhaps. Okay.
Well, while you're waiting for the next step to come up, as I said, we posted the 2019 board priorities, both the federal version and the state version. Those are for you to look at and to determine as a board if those continue to be your priorities. There are a few areas where I would make recommended changes. Obviously, on the state side, you've got the school calendar issue, which is no longer an issue, so that, or no longer, I think, important enough to be a priority at this point, given the changes that were made last year. So that's something that you could pull off of there. I've heard you all talk about the SLIFE student issue, the issue with attendance, and the issue with dropout rate. So those are possible additions on that side of the ledger. And then on the funding side, I think the funding issues are all still relevant. County Sitting Taxing Authority is one that you might consider putting on there as your own board's priority. And then finally, you should mention, and we added this to the joint program position, this is a rebenchmarking year, so you want to make sure that the state at least fully funds rebenchmarking, if nothing else.
Okay, great. We have the next steps. So starting with 119. Karen is asking, where do Virginia and Fairfax County rank in terms of federal funding? Is that correct? Okay. Number 120, Karen is also asking, that reflect what you're asking? Okay. 121. Okay, 122, the other Karen.
I don't know whether Karen, you might want to say as necessities rather than luxury items.
Okay, Evans. Sandy, is that? Okay, 124, Megan. Megan, is that good?
And that we're going to have the subsequent infographics to
Right,
accompany it.
And create infographics, yeah. Okay, Dahlia's on the history of the city-county issue in Arlington, and Megan's on the joint position. Okay, seeing no opposition to those, this work session is over.
So we can post those whenever.